Good morning, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. My name is Dan Napier, and I'm a member of the Board of Directors here at the Ottawa branch of the National Association of Federal Retirees. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which the National Association's Ottawa branch office is located is traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. On behalf of the branch, I'm pleased to welcome you all today to this session on women's heat and cold safety, providing a detailed look at the contrasting responses between men and women during heat or cold exposure. And we'd also like to welcome our presenters, Carolyn Lee Mahoney and Kelly King, PhD candidates at the Human and Environmental Physiology Research Unit at University of Ottawa, which is led by Dr. Glenn Kelly, who are all here this morning. Dr. Kenny and the research team unit have worked with the branch many times in the past to bring our members some great webinars on heat safety. So welcome to Caroline, Kelly, and Dr. Kenny. I would also just like to say that we are, I guess, really, Antoine, we're ready to go.
Perfect.
Juste une autre chose, veuillez noter que le webinaire sera présenté en anglais, mais la participation bilingue est toujours encouragée. So I'd like to give a special welcome to anyone here who is not yet a member of the association, and we hope that these webinars will inspire you to join us. And to all of our members who are here, we hope that these webinars will encourage you to maintain your membership. And finally, before we start, if you have any questions, please type them in the question and answer box throughout the session. Our presenters will read them and we will respond to those questions and answers at the end of the presentation. So that's all for me right now, and I'm going to turn the presentation over to our presenters. Thank you.
All right, so hello everyone. My name is Caroline Lee Maloney. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Ottawa. My research is focused on the unique ways women are affected by heat stress. My thesis is concerning menopause, but I'm also a health systems impact research fellow at Health Canada, where I'm looking at how heat stress affects pregnancy. This is Dr. Kelly King, who recently completed her PhD at the University of Ottawa. She is our cold stress specialist. Her thesis was concerned with the cellular mechanisms of cold exposure and how that can affect both young and older adults. And right now she's transitioning into a postdoctoral fellowship. Wonderful. All right, so I am going to start talking about heat stress because that's my specialty.
I'm sorry, I'm just gonna, would you mind talking a bit closer to the mic? It's a bit hard to hear you.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Can you hear me a bit better now?
A bit better, yes.
Okay. So I'm going to talk a bit about heat stress. There's growing acknowledgement that sexes are affected differently by extreme heat events, and these differences can manifest in really harmful ways for women. During the Western heat dome that engulfed BC in 2021, older women were disproportionately affected, and more of them lost their lives due to heat illness compared to men. And in 2022, the European summer heat wave strongly affected women, and it was found that more French women died from the heat than men. These events and others have sounded an alarm in both the public health world and in the media. Articles in major news publications such as the New York Times or The Guardian have raised concerns as to the sex divide. However, one should be mindful of the fact that the factors that influence the vulnerability of women to extreme heat are very complex and varied. Women are not necessarily inferior to men, nor are they helpless to protect themselves from the heat. By looking at the scientific evidence of how women respond to the heat and what factors might be an influence, we can all make better health decisions. So I will be looking at what makes heat dangerous and how our bodies try to keep cool, what the physiological and behavioral differences are between the sexes when we get hot, how going through menopause might be a key factor in how we respond to heat, and finally, some strategies that can be implemented to keep yourself cool. First and foremost, how do we cool down from the heat? When it gets hot, we cool down through three main ways: sweating, which dissipates the heat through the evaporation of water on the surface of the skin. Vasodilation, or the expansion of blood vessels, which allows hot blood to come to the surface of the body and release heat. And through our behavior, things like removing layers of clothing. However, these mechanisms might not be enough to cool us down, especially if there's other environmental factors at play. If the air is too humid, as in there's a high percentage of water in the air, sweat can no longer evaporate off our skin. This means that sweating doesn't effectively cool us down. If the temperatures are high enough and we are exposed for too long, our bodies store heat and we cannot compensate through sweating or vasodilation. The Public Health Agency of Canada has identified indoor temperatures above 31 degrees as being a threshold for dangerous heat, especially for those who are elderly or have chronic disease. Prolonged exposure to heat can result in heat exhaustion, which is characterized by symptoms like confusion, fatigue, and nausea. The worst and longest exposures can result in heat stroke, which can cause the loss of consciousness, organ damage, and cardiac arrest. So now that I've talked about the morbid stuff, I'm going to go into the physiological mechanisms themselves. As I mentioned, sweating is one of the main ways we lose heat, and women and men differ greatly in how we sweat. Women have a greater density of sweat glands compared to men, so for every centimeter of our skin, we have more sweat glands. However, they are much smaller, and as a result, the volume of sweat we can produce is much less. Furthermore, when our body temperature increases in response to heat stress, it actually takes us longer to start sweating. As a note, this is not a problem in mild to moderate heat, nor is it generally a problem during exercise. Women are considered efficient sweaters. Less sweat is wasted by pulling on our skin. Women and men also fare about the same in very humid situations, as sweating has become less effective in this situation. However, in very hot temperatures or in dry heat, humans are much more reliant on sweating as a main way to lose heat. Women are then at a disadvantage because we can't sweat as much, and our bodies store more heat than it does for men. As well, although we sweat less in volume, sweating can have a stronger effect on our fluid balance than it does for men. Women have less water in our body overall, 55% compared to 60% for men. Women proportionally have less water as we have a healthy, higher percentage of body fat. It's just normal for us to have more fat on our bodies. This means that even if we lose less water in total volume from sweating, we lose more water in proportion to our total body mass. And as a result, we can become dehydrated. Dehydration from sweating can increase the risk of heat exhaustion. This is in part due to how dehydration can lower blood pressure. Less water in your body means less blood, and less blood means less pressure. So I'm going to talk a bit about vasodilation, and I want you to keep in mind what I discussed about blood pressure because this is going to be relevant. Women and men do not differ in how well they vasodilate. The amount of heat you lose through this mechanism is generally the same between the two sexes. However, vasodilation distributes blood away from the core of your body and your main blood vessels into the periphery of the body, namely into the skin. This can decrease your blood pressure, more so if you're also dehydrated. Women are especially prone to low blood pressure due to differences in how our nervous system functions. One particular form of low blood pressure, orthostatic hypotension, is common in women and can happen in the heat. Orthostatic hypotension is when the blood pools in the extremities and cannot reach the head as well. It's common when you are standing up abruptly after sitting or lying down for a long time, or if you suddenly stop intense exercise. The symptoms can be mild, like dizziness, but it can also result in nausea or fainting. The one good thing about aging is that it generally increases our resting blood pressure, which makes problems like orthostatic hypotension less likely in older women. As well, women have generally smaller hearts and smaller bodies. This means that less blood is pumped by the heart. We have less blood overall. When it gets hot, Our blood is redistributed away from the heart by vasodilation, and our blood volume is reduced by dehydration. Our heart has to compensate for both of these things. It does so by increasing how often it pumps, the heart rate. Cardiac drift, which is the progressive upward increase in heart rate, can occur from heat exposure due to this loss of blood volume away from the heart. This stresses out the heart and increases the likelihood of arrhythmias, which are irregular heartbeats, or severe cardiac events. This is perhaps a major contributor to the higher mortality that we are seeing in women from heat waves. So these are sort of the negatives. Let's focus on the positives about women. Although there's a distinct disadvantage in how women sweat in the heat and how vasodilation affects our cardiovascular system is different, the ways in which women perceive and respond to heat can be to our benefit. Women are more likely to experience and report discomfort from the heat compared to men due to differences in our perception. However, we are also more likely to seek out solutions to make ourselves comfortable. Women are more likely to seek out cooler environments or change their environment to be cooler in response to high temperatures. And by preventing a situation where they're likely to overheat, they protect themselves from heat illness. Women are also better at preventing overheating during exercise, work, or other activity. Studies have shown that female marathon runners are better at pacing themselves when running in the heat compared to male runners. This means that even though the female marathon runners have a reduced sweat output, they maintain a similar level of heat in their bodies compared to men. Female athletes are also more likely to take breaks or modify their training in order to prevent overheating. Finally, while hydration can be a concern, as I've discussed, women engage in more voluntary rehydration than men. They tend to drink water before they become dehydrated enough to feel thirsty. So I'd like to talk a bit about menopause, which is something that many of you have probably experienced. Obviously, a normal, natural part of our lives as we age. A key characteristic of the onset of menopause is that sex hormone levels, namely estrogen and progesterone, drastically fall. This can bring about many undesirable symptoms and can be a huge source of stress for many women. Two symptoms in particular are related to how we perceive heat. There's hot flashes, which is that sudden feeling of heat in your upper body, especially in your face and your chest, and night sweats, when heavy sweating throughout the night can cause you to wake up and soak through clothes and bed linens. So about 80% of all postmenopausal women have experienced these symptoms to some degree. There's a lot of triggers for hot flashes, including your own emotional health and emotional triggers, but generally speaking, postmenopausal women report more heat intolerance and higher rates of hot flashes and night sweats when it's hot, especially during the summer. It's important to know that hot flashes aren't always due to an increase in your body temperature. So just because you feel like you're overheating doesn't mean that your body's actually overheating. Hot flashes can occur at any time. Rather, the hot flashes are due to the loss of estrogen. Estrogen is important in helping your brain maintain thermoregulation. It's also a very strong vasodilator and helps keep those blood vessels expanded. Finally, menopause can make sweating become dysfunctional as well. Postmenopausal women get the worst of both worlds. They start sweating at a lower temperature than premenopausal women, but they also don't produce enough sweat to cool down. Menopause is under-researched, and we still don't have a good idea of how postmenopausal women respond to heat differently compared to younger women or to men. We don't know to what degree menopause hampers the ability to stay cool. Right now, our research unit is running a series of studies focused on postmenopausal women, examining how different experiences in menopause can affect our ability to use vasodilation. We are still looking for women that match any of these criteria: women with severe hot flashes, women with no hot flashes ever, women who are type 2 diabetics, or women who are on hormone replacement therapy, such as estrogen or progesterone. Finally, here are some basic strategies to keep you cool. In your home, use air conditioning, especially if the indoor temperature reaches above 26 degrees Celsius. Limit the use of heat-producing devices such as ovens. Open the windows when the outside air is cooler. When you're out and about, listen to your body, pace yourself during activity and take breaks if needed. Keep water on hand and stay under the shade. These are all general recommendations. We still don't have enough research to tailor these recommendations for women.
All right, and with that, we'll move to the other side of the thermometer with cold stress. So when it comes to environmental related deaths, cold stress is actually the most deadly. In more cases, the environment is too cold for humans compared to environments that are too warm for humans. And this is the case on every continent in the world where cold-related deaths surpasses heat-related deaths. Interestingly, in opposition to what we generally see with heat stress, cold stress generally has deaths more often in men than women. So first, let's look into what actually defines a cold exposure. We generally look at cold exposure as either cold air or cold water exposures. When we're looking at cold air, we generally define that as temperatures of 25 degrees or below. When we are in environments that are 12 degrees or below, we start to see changes in our dexterity. So our ability to do fine motor skills is reduced. And then temperatures below 8 degrees, we see an impact on our ability to sense touch. Below 0, that's when we're starting to get into that territory where we're at risk for our peripheral tissues. So our hands and our feet especially are at risk for freezing, which would develop into frostbite. With heat exposure, we generally see that one of the big factors is not only the temperature, but also the humidity. When we're looking at cold exposure, not only is it the temperature outside, but also the wind speed. So looking at this table here, on the y-axis, we see an increase in wind speed as we move downward, and then across the x-axis, we see a decrease in temperature as we move to the right. For example, if we're looking at a temperature of negative 25 degrees and a calm wind, it would usually take around 30 minutes before frostbite will start to set in. As the wind speed increases, that time to frostbite gradually decreases to up to 5 minutes. Water, on the other hand, is a completely different ballpark. There is a lot more heat transfer, up to 25 times more heat transfer in cold water than there is cold air. Similarly to cold air, we generally define cold water as 25 degrees or below, where a neutral water would be around 35 degrees to maintain your core temperature. However, it quickly cools down your body at a much faster rate than cold air, where we see our maximum physiological responses. So this would be your vasoconstriction and your shivering in water temperatures of 15 degrees below or below. So essentially, if you're in a temperature that's below 15, even as it progressively gets lower, you're not able to essentially shiver anymore to compensate for those temperatures. Another phenomenon we have to be concerned about, especially when we're looking at cold water, is a phenomenon called afterdrop. So in a study, they looked at individuals who are immersed in 22-degree water for 60 minutes, and they tried 3 different methods to rewarm them by either letting them naturally shiver, to let them breathe in warm air, or rewarm them using 40-degree water immersions. And on this graph to the right of the red line, we see the cooling period, and the left of the right red line, we see the cooling period, and to the right of the red line, we see the rewarming period. On the y-axis, we have their change in core temperature. And even as the rewarming period starts, there's still a significant amount of time where we're seeing a decrease in that core temperature, even with all 3 of these different methods to rewarm. And this is because all the cold blood in our extremities are then being redirected to the heart and continues to cool down the core. So with cooling of the core, we have to be concerned about hypothermia. So a normal core temperature is 37 degrees. However, if we break down the word hypo and thermia, we see hypo meaning below and thermia meaning temperature. So it's a reduction in core temperature. From a clinical definition, we generally see this at 35 degrees. However, it's not always applicable to be able to measure someone's temperature. So a proxy in order to identify if someone may be experiencing hypothermia is to look at the umbles. So this is defined as the grumble. So they may have a very negative outlook. They may have the mumble, so they're not able to enunciate their words very clearly. And then they may have the stumbles, which not only is related to their fine motor skills, but also their gross motor skills. So they may have a lot of issues with coordination. If anyone is experiencing these symptoms, it's very important to get people in to see medical attention right away and rewarm them as quickly as possible. However, even though hypothermia can lead to injuries and death, it is not the major cause for this massive increase in cold-related deaths during the winter. We see this as an example when we look at the AMA female divers, who are Japanese pearl divers who will dive into the ocean all throughout the year. So this means that they're not only diving when the water is warm in the summer, but as the water gets cold in the winter. And up until 1977, they used to wear cotton swimsuits, which means that they would have very little insulation, and we would see their core temperature decrease well into the hypothermic range, and they weren't having any major adverse effects. This is because our bodies are actually able to acclimate to cold exposure, so we can withstand these colder temperatures, not only in the environment, but also inside our body without having any major adverse effects. Just for context, after 1977, they started introducing wetsuits, which allowed them to do longer dives, which is more desirable because it meant that it was going to be more profitable. But we did see that with this added insulation, their effect of their acclimation was slightly less. So if it's not hypothermia that's leading to these excess deaths, what exactly is causing this? And it comes down to vasoconstriction. So this is the narrowing of the blood vessels, particularly in the peripheral area. So we're talking about your arms and your legs. This allows an increase in insulation because less heat is lost through the warm blood. So with a normal artery, we generally see a lot of loss of heat into the environment, but with less blood flow with vasoconstriction, we're seeing less heat lost overall. There are also sex-related differences when it comes to vasoconstriction. Most notably, women vasoconstrict at a much higher temperature than men, which in this case is actually a very good thing because over time they will lose less heat. However, this also means that they're going to reach their maximum vasoconstriction much earlier than men, which means that we have to rely on other heat-producing and heat-conserving mechanisms to survive. So how does vasoconstriction indicate an increase in cold-related deaths? Well, it has to do with how vasoconstriction redistributes blood from the periphery to the central core of the body. When we have a redistribution to that central core, it means there's more blood volume at our core, but since it's an enclosed system, it also means that we're seeing an increase in the blood pressure that's entering our heart. Since our heart is experiencing a higher load, that drastically increases your risk for heart attack, especially as we get older, we see a decreased ability to handle such high loads during cold exposure. One other major component when it comes to cold exposure is shivering. This is generally seen as the last physiological defense to produce heat, and it's usually in mammals and in some birds. And the reason why it's this last physiological defense mechanism is because it's very metabolically expensive. So when you're looking at maximum shivering, we at most can produce about 5 times the amount of heat production as we do during rest. In comparison, using these same fuel sources that we use to shiver, we can use in voluntary exercise, such as running at maximum levels, to get up to 15 to 20-fold increase of heat production compared to your basal level. Interestingly, humans are actually a little bit of an anomaly when it comes to shivering, in that we heavily rely on shivering up to almost 40% of our total heat production when it comes to even milder cold exposure. And just like with vasoconstriction, there are, again, sex-related differences. In general, women perceive cold at a much higher temperature than men, which means we also have an earlier onset of shivering. However, we do produce less heat at our maximum shivering rates compared to men, and is likely due to differences in how much muscle mass men and women typically have. So looking into the factors that actually lead to sex-related differences in the cold, we often question how does estrogen, which is a common sex hormone, may impact our ability to thermoregulate during cold exposure. It's also very important to understand how menopause, that change in our estrogen, may affect cold exposure and our ability to thermoregulate. However, given the current literature, we actually don't have a clear picture as to how this will play into role when it comes to sex-related differences. We do know that estrogen plays a role in our ability to control our blood vessel diameter, as we mentioned earlier with the vasodilation. So there is tendencies to think that it may play a role in that vasoconstriction. Additionally, we know that estrogen is partially in charge of fuel selection during shivering. So our muscles can use proteins, carbohydrates, and fats when we're shivering, and estrogen helps dictate that. We see that in women, since women tend to favor more lipids or fats when we're shivering, as opposed to men who typically use more carbohydrates. However, all in all, it boils down to simply body morphology differences, specifically the torso size. If we look at all the literature that has looked at sex-related differences, they often will account for these differences in body morphologies, since women tend to have higher body fat percentages. If you account for these differences between men and women, almost all sex-related differences are nullified. Specifically, when we're looking at body morphology, we're looking at the surface area to volume ratios. So since body fat has a higher volume, we generally will see less heat loss. For example, in the cylinders, a cylinder with higher volume and lower surface area is going to retain more heat and have overall less heat loss than a cylinder with a smaller volume and a larger surface area. Keeping in mind that this is quite the opposite when we're talking about heat stress. So regardless of sex-related differences, there are behavioral cold strategies that can be employed by everyone. First and foremost, and the more obvious one, is that staying indoors and using external heat sources to prevent getting cold in the first place will help drastically reduce any cold-related deaths or potential injuries. However, if you are engaging in outdoor activities or outdoor work, it's really important to keep your face, hands, and feet covered, since this is the highest risk area for frostbite. Additionally, when you're planning out your layers that you're going to be wearing outside, it's best to avoid a lot of cotton, because that actually will help dissipate heat more, which is the opposite of what you want to do when you're going out in the cold. And then you can also help by staying active. As I mentioned earlier, voluntary movements will produce more heat than our maximum shivering. So by doing moderate amounts of work, even vigorous amounts of work, we can definitely get a lot of heat production to keep warm. However, there is a caveat with activity like this. For example, you don't want to be working so hard that you're sweating, because as soon as you stop working, you're going to have that evaporation and therefore that heat loss. However, if you're not in a position where you can moderate your intensity of your work, you can also help prevent this by wearing a base layer of something that is activewear, where it's going to wick away the sweat before it's able to evaporate. Another consideration is whether or not you're going to be working near or on water. So for example, if you're going out kayaking, you need to be dressing for the water temperature rather than the air temperature. And then if you're going on a multi-day trip, it seems very simple, but it's very important that you change your socks daily. Again, your feet are one of the higher risk areas for frostbite. And if you don't change your socks, you're standing on your feet all day, and that the insulation layer gets compressed. So by changing your socks, you're essentially refreshing your insulation layer. And then lastly, it's always a good idea to keep a hypothermia kit on you if you're working or outdoors during temperatures of 15 degrees or below. This can include having an extra set of dry clothes in case your clothes get wet, having a sleeping bag that can help insulate someone who has become too cold, having matches around so that you can create a fire so that you can have an external heat source, and to bring a warm drink, although we suggest that you avoid any caffeine because caffeine can increase your heart rate, and then that's going to mean that you're going to have an increase in heat dissipation. And with that, we would both like to say thank you very much for coming to our presentation. We have a lot of studies that require human volunteers, so if you're interested in participating in any of our work, feel free to reach out to Caroline or I, or you can look at our website at hepru.ca. And with that, we'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Caroline, and thank you, Kelly, for this great presentation. We do have some questions, and the first question is from MO, and she states, I'm in my 70s, and I guess I was one of the fortunate ones as I never had hot flashes, even when I was going through menopause. Is there a reason for this?
So there are some characteristics that people who have severe hot flashes have compared to women who don't. But the literature is a little bit divided. We actually don't know enough about hot flashes. Generally speaking,
Sorry, Caroline, we can't hear you.
yeah, sorry about that. I need to get a little bit closer. So generally speaking, women who are more physically active generally have reduced hot flashes or no hot flashes. This isn't always the case. Sometimes you can have a highly active woman who also has severe hot flashes, but it's less common. If you were not a smoker, you're less likely to have hot flashes. Women with an extensive smoking history tend to have more hot flashes than women who do not. And if you go into menopause later, you actually are more likely to have more severe hot flashes than a woman who goes into menopause earlier. These are just general population level characteristics. It's hard to pinpoint exactly why a woman has hot flashes or does not have hot flashes.
Thank you. Thank you for that. The next question is also from Emma, where she states, the hot weather doesn't bother me and I don't seem to feel the heat like others do. Is there a reason for this? I know you touched on that.
Some people are just very acclimated to their heat or have, again, characteristics that make them withstand the heat a little bit better. Acclimation is one. If you spend a lot of time being physically active or are in hot environments a lot, then that will reduce your perception of heat and that will make the heat more tolerable. Can you think of anything else that you'd like to say? Because those are the kind of the main ones. If you manage to acclimate yourself to the heat through exposure or through exercise, then you're not going to be there as poorly in the heat as someone who does not do those things.
I think just a little bit add on to that, in general, you have to consider that everyone's tolerance to pretty much anything is going to be on an individual level. There's usually a somewhat of a genetic aspect to it, and there's also an environmental aspect to it. But overall, it really just depends on person to person and how they perceive the different environments.
Thank you. There's an anonymous attendee who would like to know, I have naturally very low blood pressure. Would that make me more susceptible to having difficulties during heat waves?
It might make you more susceptible to difficulties during heat waves, again, due to that vasodilation in the body. It's really important during heat waves, if you know you have naturally low blood pressure, to maintain your hydration level, to avoid doing physical activity per se and then stopping. Doing a proper cool down is always really important anytime you physically exercise in order to prevent that orthostatic hypotension. Again, don't get up rapidly when you're lying down for a long time. All these sorts of things might improve your ability to stay safe during a heat wave. That's about it. Cooling is actually always the most important thing. If you can avoid getting overheated, especially if you know you have this vulnerability due to your low blood pressure, then you're going to be safer overall.
Okay, thank you. A question from Diane. Can hysterectomy and lower estrogen affect me, and how?
So hysterectomy, if you've had a complete hysterectomy, that does mean that your body no longer produces any estrogen. So if you were not menopausal before you had the hysterectomy, then you go into complete menopause after the hysterectomy. There's not a lot of evidence whether having a hysterectomy post-menopause actually affects you differently than a woman who's never had a hysterectomy. There's not a lot of research as to whether having your uterus and ovaries removed modulates your estrogen levels in a significant way compared to a woman who has not had that. So I guess the answer is, if you go into complete menopause earlier than expected, it could affect you just because you are postmenopausal for a longer period of time than maybe another woman. But if you had it after you went into menopause, it's likely not a significant effect.
Thank you. Just a note to participants, if you do have any questions, please use the question and answer box that is at the bottom of your screen and just type your question in. An anonymous attendee would like to know, I get so hot that I sweat profusely on my face. After menopause, I don't sweat as much over my body, but still so much on my face. Why?
So one of the things that happens as we age is that different regions of our body respond differently to heat stress. Most of our heat loss is through our limbs, so through our arms and our legs. When these mechanisms become impaired, when you can't sweat as much through your arms and your legs because of the effects of age or because of the effects of menopause, essentially your face and your chest become overactive in response. It's like your body knows that you need to lose heat and you're not doing it effectively. So the parts of your body that have sweat glands that are responding more readily go into overdrive.
Another question is, what is the average age of women experiencing menopause?
Usually it starts in your mid 40s. Sometimes it can start in your 50s. Women are usually considered postmenopausal, that is 1 year without a menstrual cycle, in their mid 50s. Again, there's a lot of variation. Some women are not postmenopausal until they're 60. Some women are postmenopausal in their 40s, all of which are fairly normal.
Okay. Another question, is it bad to put deodorant on the face to control sweat? A follow-up question to getting so hot over my face.
I would not recommend that. I'm not an expert on antiperspirant. I assume you meant antiperspirant and not deodorant. Deodorant just sort of blocks any smell. Antiperspirant would actually block the sweat glands. I would not recommend doing that on your face because it would also increase the amount of heat in your body. You need to be able to sweat, even though it's uncomfortable. That sweating does actually ultimately help you.
Okay, again, if you have any questions, we still have a few minutes, and please type your questions into the chat box. But I have one question. Are the effects of heat and cold trauma like cumulative?
At least I can speak from the cold side. There is definitely, it depends on the severity of the cold trauma. So they've done studies where people who have previously experienced mild to moderate or even severe cold injuries, and it does impair a lot of the neural network that helps drive our thermoregulation. So, for example, if you've had essentially a cold injury on your hand, subsequent cold injuries are then more likely to happen because you're not able to essentially tell the parts of your hand to vasoconstrict more effectively to conserve heat. So yes, it definitely can drastically affect your ability to deal with cold injuries. And I know just from a little bit about the heat stress that you can often see cumulative effects depending on severity as well. So as you approach that heat exhaustion, heat stroke era, you can cause permanent damage to a lot of your organs, which can be lasting across the lifespan, although it is possible also to recover depending on severity. So those mild to moderate are more likely to recover fully. However, the more severe you get, the more likely it is going to have permanent damage.
Thank you so much. Well, I don't see any other questions, so we'd like to thank everyone for their participation, and the Ottawa branch would also like to say a special thanks to Carolyn and Kelly for their very informative presentation, and would also like to thank Dr. Kenny for helping us organize this presentation. Remember to look for our follow-up email, and if you do have any further questions, you can we will send you you can respond to or put something in a question to us, and we'll try and get it answered. That follow-up email will also include information on how to access the recording of today's session. Today's session was recorded for your future convenience, so you can take a look at it, as well as contact information, as I mentioned, for our presenters. Would also like to mention that we welcome you to invite non-members to attend these webinars and give us a try as a guest. And to register for these upcoming webinars, there's a lot more webinars coming up. Please visit the Ottawa branch website. We'll make sure to include our web address to that website if you don't have it in a follow-up email to all of you. So if there's nothing further, then thank you to everyone, and we will see you at our next presentation.
Thank you, everyone.